Writing and Reading Center, keeping the pen out of your hand. Another very important goal for the Writing Center. We're always reminding ourselves that the students we work with and the assignments that we work with them on, that they are student-centered papers, that what they do should be student-centered. So we want to keep the pen out of our hand as much as possible. And here are some ways to do that. So, using questioning techniques. By asking lots and lots of questions and having the student answer in writing is an excellent way to help keep the pen out of our hand, but also to have set an active learning environment for students by asking questions, open-ended questions. So, some starter questions for you to ask. Do you have your assignment, prompt, or instructions? What is your central point or main argument? This is one of my favorite questions, because if the student can articulate verbally what they're writing about, and I read their paper and I can't identify that, then there's a disconnect between what the student is thinking and what they're actually writing, and that's something that we need to concentrate on in the session. Another really important question is, what are you most concerned about with this paper? You'll find that many students are very honest about what they struggle with when it comes to writing, and they will tell you that they struggle with putting their sentences together or organizing their ideas, and these are things that you'll know going into the session that you need to look for in the paper. Other questions, also very important. Did they complete step 1? How many items did they check off? When is this assignment due? There's a big difference between an essay that's due the next day versus one that's due 2 weeks from now. Where are they in the process? Is this a first draft, a second draft? Are they getting close to completing it? All very important questions, and these are only a few. There's lots of questions you can ask the student as your tutoring session goes on. We want to ask open-ended questions as much as possible. Open-ended questions are questions that don't have a yes or no answer. So for example, this is an interesting topic. Why did you choose it? And give the student time to answer. How well did you feel you organized your essay? What did you mean by, or what was your intention when you come across a paragraph that isn't very clear? Can you tell me more about this? When you come across a paragraph that doesn't have a lot of detail to it. In essence, be an active listener. Remember silence and wait times. Silence and wait times are, when you ask a question, give the student at least 10 seconds to answer. That's just an average number. But basically you don't want to sit there in awkward silence, but you do want to give a student time to think and respond. Or you can restate the question in another way if they're sitting there and they look confused. So, some bad examples, and I've often walked by a session and heard these questions, and they just don't sound right. Do you understand what I'm saying? Do you have a thesis? Can you reword this? Why don't you just write and then fill in how you, the tutor, would say it better? We don't want to give the students the answers, but we want to ask those open-ended questions so that they can respond and you can say, hey, that's a really good idea. Why don't you write that down? So, an overview. First thing you need to do is familiarize yourself with the assignment. The second thing you need to do is familiarize yourself with the writer. What type of writer are you working with? What class is it for? And thirdly, ask open-ended questions and be an active listener. So, getting students to write sometimes isn't as easy. And again, here are some strategies that we can work with to keep the pen out of our hand. Rules of thumb. Don't sit down at a table with the pen in your hand. If you have difficulty with this, and I did when I first started tutoring, I just sat down and I told the student, hey, why don't you get a pen and paper out? I'm going to give you some notes and I want you to write them down. Or, if you feel the need to write something down, have a notepad at your disposal as well as some highlighters. This way, you're taking notes or you're doing something on a separate sheet of paper and not on the student's own work. Ask the student to get out his or her own paper and to be ready to write. Keep the paper in front of the student. This is very important, especially body language-wise. If someone walks by and you're sitting with the student and their paper is in front of you and you have the pen in their hand and the student is sitting there doing absolutely nothing or playing on their cell phone, it doesn't look too good. Resist the urge to correct every single error in the paper. This is going to be difficult if you're a new tutor. I know it was for me. But skip over things that minute. Unless you can not understand what the student is saying, then you need to stop and talk about it. But just really bite your tongue when it comes to all the run-ons and some grammatical errors and misspellings. Essays and writing assignments. So, we work with students on the writing process. So when we work with students, we're looking at pre-writing, brainstorming, listing, free writing, outlining, idea mapping, inquiry questions to get them thinking about what they'd like to write about. Then we work on the drafting stage. So we like to have students write multiple drafts. We encourage them to do this. Look at them from their look at the drafts from their writer's weaknesses, from his or her perspective. You shouldn't be pointing these out, but ask the student, what are your weaknesses? What do we need to consider before we start drafting or while we're drafting? Point out the areas for improvement from a tutor perspective. If a student comes to you with a draft and you read over it and you've asked the student what they think they need help with, you can point out, like, I'm reading your paper and there's some really good things about it, but I get a little confused about what your main point is. What's your main argument? You seem to have 3 or 4 main arguments going on. Can we talk about that? Explore the possibilities together. You may notice that students verbally can express what they would like to focus on or what they would like to do more than they do when they're writing. So you can explore this with the student and give them suggestions about what the next step should be. Question: offer suggestions and opinions, but don't evaluate the student's work. Again, you're not the instructor. The instructor is the one that really should be telling them if it's A or B or C, or whether something is good or bad. But you can offer an opinion. If something is confusing to you as you're reading it, then it's likely going to be confusing to others or the instructor. And it's okay to say that. So when it comes to revising, so a student has a draft and they come to you and they say, I've worked on this, this is my second draft. You want to look at it from a global perspective. So development. Did the writer follow through on points raised in the thesis? Did the writer offer enough supporting details and examples? Did the writer explain relationships between ideas? Again, this is the high order concerns, the content, the thesis, those types of things versus some of the smaller factors that come into writing in the later stages of the writing process. Organization. Did the writer organize according to our particular scheme or format? Did the writer explain relationships between ideas? Things like transitions are really important in writing, and those are things that sometimes students can't identify, but you can as an outside reader. Then there's the revising at the sentence level, and again, this comes at later stages in the writing process. Once a student has gone through several drafts, and probably they have a thesis that's been identified, and most of their organization is there. Now we're going to look at sentence level errors. Students, in order to help students develop their own proofreading skills, students should read their paper aloud. They're likely to catch their own errors. This is with the exception of students who possibly have English as a second language or may have a learning disability. Those students often need a little help because the language, it sounds different to them than it would to someone who is a native speaker or who understands grammar pretty well. Work in small sections of a paper. You'll notice when you're working with students that there's grammatical error after grammatical error, and you don't want to overwhelm the student. So really take chunks of the paper, maybe take the first paragraph or two, and look at that. Look for common repetitive grammatical errors. That's really important because you don't want to tell a student, wow, your essay is full of fragments, run-ons, comma splices, misspellings. That's really overwhelming for a student, and they'll leave here thinking they're a bad writer. But you can say, I noticed in the first couple paragraphs that you've got quite a few fragments. Define what a fragment is, and then help them find them in the paper so that they don't continually do it. You're also teaching them something so that they can identify them themselves. So read sentence by sentence to help students identify wordiness, omitted words, colloquial language, choppy sentences, or passive voice. This type of writing isn't really standard American academic English from our perspective and what we're helping students with. So, but again, this falls on a low order concern, and you don't want to talk about all of these things at one time. Demonstrate techniques for improvement. Get another pen and paper and help students figure out how to write a good sentence, or use one of the whiteboards to help them to do some sentence diagramming. Students really appreciate that. Model for students and have them model or say back what they've learned from you. So after you've explained what a fragment is, maybe after you've looked at another paragraph, say, tell me, why is this a fragment? and have them explain it to you so that you know, as this tutor, that they're understanding what you're saying. So, again, going back to that this is a student-owned paper. The student writes down the plan for the revision as was discussed in the agenda, or you're writing this down together. The tutor assigns a task within the session or for the next appointment if there isn't enough time to do something. And then the student works independently or comes back to a later appointment. You're not going to be able to cover everything in one session, but it's important that the student know when they leave that here's what we've covered and here's what still needs to be worked on, and that you've helped the student identify those things so that they can work on something on their own once you've explained it to them, and they can come back with the revision and hopefully it's been an improvement. All right, so getting students to refocus. Again, this comes up sometimes. Students get frustrated very easily and they want to lay blame on the instructor, on being tired, on whatever it may be, but we want to get them to focus on the writing. And so, for you to do this, you need to react as a reader. You are a tutor, but if you word things in a way by using I statements, such as I'm confused by the second sentence, or I got a little lost here. From your introduction, I expected to read, this sounds a little better than, you have a confusing way of writing, or the way you wrote your introduction, you really aren't clear at all. It kind of puts the onus on you, the tutor, to say, I'm confused by this. Can you explain this to me? Use say-back statements. So what I'm hearing you say is, or what it sounds like is, based on what the student is telling you, or based on what the student has written. These types of statements really help the student open up the conversation and help the student become comfortable with talking to you about their writing, which sometimes isn't that easy. Requesting information. To help students clarify, think, refocus, or organize thoughts, can you tell me more about what made you choose? And you should genuinely be interested in what they have to say. To help students with vague writing, what is your idea here? What do you want to say? What do you want your reader to know in this paragraph? How does this idea connect with what you said before? What do you mean by? So again, notice that these are all open-ended questions, and you really are listening to what the student has to say. And this will help you determine what the student is trying to say and maybe how to address what the issues are. Raising critical awareness. Critical thinking is something that students struggle with when they're writing. Now, I'm sure that you've had instructors ask you, so what? Or have written on your paper, so what? And it's not a derogatory phrase. It's more about, has the student identified purpose and audience? Why does the audience need to be aware of whatever their topic is? Has the student justified other points in their paper? It also causes them to do some rethinking. How would someone who disagrees with you respond to your argument? If that's so, what would happen if playing a little bit of a devil's advocate with the student can help them develop that critical awareness and those critical thinking skills? Now, that doesn't mean they have to include every single point in their paper, but it does get them thinking about what they're writing and how they want to say what their topic is, say more about their topic. So prompting the writer. Ask the writer questions to help them further their thinking. Why does this claim you make show whatever it is their argument is? What happens after that? And get them talking about it, get them thinking, and then if they've said something that just makes a lot of sense, tell them, write that down. That is so important to what you're saying in this paper. I don't want you to forget it. And that is all for this session, so see you for the next one.